Touch that boy and I'll break your hand before the rope ever finds his neck. Elijah Cole said it with river water still dripping off his sleeves, his boots buried in the mud of the bank, his son coughing creek water at his feet. The crowd froze. So did the Comanche boy standing waist deep near the reeds, chest heaving, hair plastered to his brow, one hand still lifted as if he might dive back in and finish saving the child nobody else had reached in time. The Pecos ran swollen and mean that spring. It slapped driftwood against the stones, sucked at the roots of cottonwoods, and carried whole branches in its brown fists. Caleb Cole had been playing too close to the ferry landing, and one rotten plank had tipped under him. By the time the shouting started, he was already gone under. Gone, that was, until the stranger brought him back. Now Caleb knelt in the mud, coughing and crying and clinging to Elijah's coat. The boy in the river looked no older than 14. He was thin, raw-boned, quick-eyed, with a cut along his cheek and a soaked deerskin shirt torn at one shoulder. His breath smoked in the cool morning air. He did not look grateful. He looked cornered. Harlan Pike spat tobacco juice into the shallows. He was prowling the landing before sunrise. Ask anyone. Might have thrown the boy in himself, then hauled him out to play savior. That true? Sheriff Bell asked, though not to find the truth. His hand already rested on the butt of his revolver. The Comanche boy said nothing. Elijah rose slowly. Water streamed from his hat brim. His right hand, scarred from plow handles and winter axes, tightened around the rifle he had dropped in the rush to the bank. My son was drowning, he said. This boy went in after him. Pike's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. A snake can pull a child from water if it means getting near the henhouse. Caleb tried to speak through chattering teeth. Pa, he said. He grabbed me. He pushed me up. I couldn't breathe, and he kept my head above the water. Elijah crouched, brushed wet hair from Caleb's eyes, then looked back at the stranger. The boy's lips were blue. He was bleeding from the forearm, where something sharp in the current had opened him up. Men ringed the bank with hard faces and harder silence. Behind them, the town of Dry Hollow watched from its porches and wagon seats, dust-colored and suspicious. Elijah heard the wind creak through the ferry post, smelled river muck, horse sweat, cold iron, and the faint ash scent that always drifted from Pike's smithy. He also smelled fear, not the loud kind, the quiet kind that made ordinary men cruel before breakfast. What's your name? He asked. The boy's eyes flicked to the sheriff, then back to Elijah. Tawa. Pike gave a laugh with no humor in it. Name him whatever you like. I call him Trouble. Elijah looked at the cut on Tawa's arm, the bruises already blooming on his ribs, the way his bare toes gripped the stones as if he expected to run. Then he made the choice that would split Dry Hollow clean down the middle. He comes with me. A murmur rolled through the crowd like distant thunder. Bell frowned. Elijah, you don't know what he's mixed in. I know what I saw. Pike stepped closer. He was broad-shouldered, rich on cattle, and mean in the small ways that lasted longest. His spurs were silver-tipped. His mustache twitched when he smiled, which he did now, though nothing in it was kind. You planning to seat him at your table too? If he saved my son, Elijah said, then he won't eat outside like a stray dog. That shocked them more than the river rescue. Women on the bank lowered their voices. One crossed herself. Belle glanced away, embarrassed not by injustice, but by anyone daring to interrupt it. Tawa did not move. Elijah took off his coat and held it out. You can freeze here or walk. For a long second the boy stared at him. Then he came up from the shallows, slow, wary, ready to bolt at any wrong twitch. He took the coat, but did not put it on. Caleb looked up at him with the stunned, fierce devotion children reserve for those who pull them back from the dark. By the time they reached the Cole farm, clouds had sunk low over the fields. The wheat bent under a restless wind. The barn doors knocked softly in their frames. Elijah's house sat plain and weathered on a rise above the river road, with a smokehouse, a chicken run, and a porch Sarah had once painted blue before fever and grief and hard seasons had worn the color down to memory. Inside, the stove still held warmth from dawn. Elijah wrapped Caleb in quilts, set a kettle on, then turned to Tawa. Up close, the boy looked worse. Rope burn on one wrist, a split lip, mud ground into his knees. Not just a wanderer then, a hunted one. Sit, Elijah said. Tawa stayed by the door. You hear me? I hear. Then sit. The boy lowered himself onto the edge of a chair without taking his eyes off the windows. Caleb, pale but recovering, whispered, "Pa." He had something in the brush. Before they came, Elijah's gaze sharpened. "What thing?" Tawa answered first. "My sister." The room went still except for the kettle beginning to mutter. "How old?" Elijah asked. 7. "Where?" "In Willow Cut by the bend." "Hidden." "Alone." Tawa nodded once. Caleb pushed up under his blankets. "Pa, we gotta get her." Elijah looked from his son to the stranger boy and saw no lie there. Only terror held tight with pride. Outside, hoofbeats sounded on the road. More than one rider. Deliberate. Unhurried. The kind of riding men did when they believed the law already belonged to them. A shadow crossed the window. Then came a knock, hard enough to rattle the frame. Pike's voice drifted through the wood. "Sun's dropping, Cole. Bring me the Indian boy by dark. If you don't, I'll come inside and fetch him with the whole town watching." Elijah did not answer the door at once. He stood very still, listening to the horses shift outside, to Caleb's breath catching in the bed, to the soft scrape of Tawa's chair as the boy rose without being told. The kettle hissed. Firelight trembled across the walls Sarah had once papered with wildflower print. For one suspended beat, the house felt less like a home than a line drawn in dust. The knock came again. "Cole," Pike said, almost cheerful now. "Wouldn't make this uglier than it needs to be." Elijah set the rifle within reach of the table and opened the door 3 inches. Wind shoved cold air in around his boots. Pike sat mounted with 4 men behind him, coats dark with mist, hats low, faces already satisfied. Sheriff Bell was not among them. That told Elijah more than if Bell had been. "He stays till morning," Elijah said. Pike leaned in his saddle. "You saying this is charity?" "I'm saying my son still has river in his lungs, and I'm done talking on my porch." "You always did mistake stubbornness for virtue." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Ride home." Pike's smile faded by degrees. "At dawn, then. You hand him over, or I call a meeting in town and let folks decide what price gratitude has." Dry Hollow won't like your answer. Elijah shut the door before Pike finished. Outside, the riders lingered a while, the leather creak of their saddles rising and falling in the wind. At last the hoofbeats receded toward town. Caleb let out the breath he had been holding. "He means it." "Yes." Tawa had not stepped away from the back wall. "I go now," he said. "Your trouble ends." "By leading them to your sister?" Elijah asked. Tawa's face hardened. "Better me than both." That stung because it was the reasoning of somebody too young to have learned it so well. Elijah crossed to the cupboard, pulled down the tin basin, and poured warm water into it. "Sit." The boy did not. Elijah stripped off his own wet overshirt, wrung it once, and showed the puckered scar under his ribs where a bullet had gone through years earlier. "I said sit. Men don't heal standing up." Something in that, maybe the refusal to beg, made Tawa obey. Elijah cleaned the cut on his arm, while the boy hissed through his teeth and refused to flinch otherwise. Caleb watched from the bed, wrapped in blankets to his chin. The room smelled of pine soap, hot metal, and the copper edge of blood. "What happened to your wrist?" Elijah asked quietly. Tawa stared at the basin. "Men with silver spurs tied me to a wagon wheel." Pike wore silver spurs. Elijah dried his hands. "Why?" "I saw them kill my uncle." The fire cracked softly. Outside the shutters ticked in the wind. "Where?" Elijah asked. "North Draw. 2 nights ago. He had ponies. They wanted them. He would not trade." Tawa swallowed. "They shot him, then burned the wagon marks so nobody could follow." Caleb pushed himself upright. "Pa." Elijah raised a hand, though his own pulse had started to beat harder. "And your sister?" Tawa's eyes flicked up. "She ran when I cut the rope. I told her Willow Cut. I told her I would come." There it was. The whole shape of the dilemma laid bare on his kitchen floor. Hand the boy over, and Pike likely buried 2 children before noon. Protect him, and Dry Hollow turned its suspicion on Elijah, maybe on Caleb too. Safety on one side, honor on the other. Sarah used to say the cruelest roads were the ones that still looked like roads. Elijah stood, crossed to the peg by the door, and took down his old field glass. "Can you walk?" Tawa blinked. "Where?" "To fetch your sister before Pike changes his mind and comes back with more men." Caleb threw off the quilts. "I'm coming." "No. I know the Willow Bend better than anybody. You nearly drowned an hour ago." Caleb met his father's eyes, stubborn as a fence post. Sarah's stubbornness, not his. Then I'll ride the mule and point. Elijah looked at his son, at the fever-bright determination in him, and understood the moment for what it was. A child had been saved, and now that child was measuring the worth of the man raising him. Whatever Elijah did next would not vanish. Boots, he said at last. They left by the back, cutting through the wheat, while twilight bled copper across the fields. Stalks brushed their legs. Damp earth sucked at their soles. The river hissed somewhere beyond the rise. Caleb rode the mule slow and stiff. Tawa moved ahead like he belonged to wind and shadow, and Elijah followed with the rifle crooked in his elbow, and every nerve stretched tight. At the willow cut, they found the girl half buried in leaves beneath the roots of an old tree, a tiny scrap of a thing with black braids and huge watchful eyes. She clutched a carved wooden horse to her chest and did not cry when Elijah lifted her out. She only looked at Tawa to see whether fear was required. It's all right, Tawa said in his own tongue. She believed him. On the way back, they saw lanterns moving on the ridge above the farm. More riders than before. Voices carried thin through the dark. Pike had not waited for dawn. The lanterns on the ridge moved like slow embers in the wind, dipping and lifting over the black line of mesquite. Elijah stopped short in the wheat and pushed the children down with one ear of his hand. The stalks whispered around them. Far off, a horse snorted. Another answered. Pike had spread his men wide, which meant he meant to search, not simply threaten. Take Caleb and the girl to the drainage ditch, Elijah whispered to Tawa. Follow it to the barn. Tawa shook his head. They watched barn first. Then where? The boy pointed toward the old sorghum shed near the river fence. Low roof. Hard to see. Caleb clutched the mule's rein. Pa, come with us. In a minute. He could feel the damp chill of night climbing through his shirt. Smelled wet grass, lantern oil, horse leather, and the bitter edge of storm air rolling down from the plains. He also smelled something else, faint but unmistakable. Smoke. Not a cooking fire. Fresh struck flame. Pike was not hunting. He was driving. Move, Elijah said. Tawa took Nita's hand and went low through the wheat, Caleb stumbling behind, all three swallowed by shadow. Elijah circled wide toward the house. If Pike wanted the farm, he would take it honest only by lying first. Elijah had known that about the man for years and never found reason enough to stand against it. Now reason walked on 2 small feet and 1 stubborn pair of wet boots. He reached the porch as a figure stepped from the darkness near the well. Sheriff Bell, you should have ended this sooner, Bell muttered. Elijah kept the rifle down but ready. You riding with Pike now? Bell's face looked older than it had that morning. I'm riding with a town afraid of what it doesn't understand. Elijah nearly laughed. No, you're hiding behind it. Bell flinched, then glanced toward the ridge. Pike says the boy stole from him. What did he steal? Bell hesitated too long. Doesn't matter. It matters to the dead uncle. The sheriff's throat worked. Before he could answer, a shout rose from behind the house. Then another. Lantern light flared between the boards of the barn. Pike's men had found the stock enclosure. Elijah shoved past Bell and ran. The barn doors stood half open. Horses kicked inside, eyes rolling white in the flicker. One man was climbing the loft ladder with a torch. Another had a shotgun trained on the stalls. Pike himself stood near the center aisle, silver spurs glinting as he turned at Elijah's approach. There you are, Pike said. Thought you might prefer to watch. Elijah raised the rifle. Drop the torch. Pike smiled thinly. And let your little guest slip off again. A small sound came from above. Nita, hidden in the loft after all. Tawa moved before Elijah could call out. He dropped from the haymow onto the torchbearer, both of them crashing into a stack of feed sacks. The torch flew. Fire licked once across loose straw. Horses screamed and slammed the stalls. Everything broke at once. Elijah fired into the rafters to scatter the men nearest the ladder, then lunged for the fallen torch and stamped it out beneath his heel. Pike swung the shotgun toward the loft. Caleb, appearing from nowhere with a shovel in both hands, drove the flat of it into Pike's elbow. The shot blasted into the roof, showering splinters and dust. Run! Elijah roared. Tawa shoved Nita toward the side hatch. Bell, who had followed in, grabbed one of Pike's hands before the man could draw his pistol. The two crashed against a post. Another rider tackled Elijah at the waist. They hit the dirt hard. The man's breath reeked of whiskey. Elijah drove a thumb into his eye, rolled, seized the dropped torch stick, and brought it down across the man's wrist until the knife fell free. By then Tawa had reached the yard with Nita. Caleb was right behind. Pike recovered faster than a snake in sun. He caught the back of Caleb's shirt and yanked him off his feet. The barn went silent in Elijah's head. "Rifle down," Pike said, pressing a revolver to the boy's temple. "Now we can talk plain." Caleb's face had gone white, but he did not cry. Dust clung to his wet hair. Blood ran from a nick above one eyebrow, where a splinter had caught him. Elijah lowered the rifle 1 inch. Tawa stood by the fence, chest heaving, one arm around Nita. In the lantern glow his eyes flashed not fear now, but recognition. He stared at Pike's spurs, then at the notch cut into the man's left boot heel. "That one," he said. "He killed my uncle." Pike's mouth twitched. "Boy sees ghosts." Tawa reached into his shirt and pulled free a small leather packet bound with blue thread. "You dropped this." Pike's composure cracked for the first time. Elijah saw it immediately. Survey paper. Folded. Sealed once, then torn. Pike had been after more than ponies. Water rights. The North Draw. Enough to ruin 3 farms and make one man rich. He was moving the boundary markers. Bell said hoarsely from the barn door, blood on his lip. "That why you kept pushing folks off the river?" Pike shoved the revolver harder against Caleb's head. "All of you shut up." Rain began then, sudden and cold, drumming on the roof, hissing in the yard dust. For one heartbeat nobody moved. Then Pike started backing toward his horse, dragging Caleb with him. "Come morning," he said. "Bring me the papers and the boy, or you can fish your son out proper this time." He swung into the saddle one-handed, hauled Caleb up before him, and spurred into the rain. The others followed, scattered and swearing. Elijah stood in the yard with the storm breaking over him. Nita crying at last, Tawa clutching the packet, and his son disappearing into the dark with the man who had just turned mercy into war. They took shelter in the sorghum shed after the riders vanished into the rain. It leaned toward the river like an old man tired of standing, with a roof patched in 3 kinds of tin and walls that breathed wine through every seam. Elijah lit a stub of lantern and set it on an upturned crate. Gold light trembled over rough boards, damp blankets, frightened children, and the blood soaking through the sleeve of his left arm, where a graze from the barn had finally begun to matter. Nita sat wrapped in one of Caleb's old coats, clutching her wooden horse so hard her knuckles shone. Tawa crouched beside her, speaking softly in Comanche until her breathing slowed. Each word landed with the quiet steadiness of a hand laid over a heartbeat. Elijah cut his shirt open at the shoulder and poured whiskey over the wound. Fire raced through him. He grunted once, no more. Tawa looked up. "You should let me. You know how." The boy nodded. From a pouch at his belt he took dried leaves, crushed them between his palms, and mixed them with a little water from the rain barrel. The shed filled with the sharp, clean smell of sage and something bitter underneath. He pressed the poultice to Elijah's arm and bound it with a torn strip from his own shirt, fingers quick and practiced. "Your mother taught you?" Elijah asked. "My grandmother first, then my mother." There was no accusation in the answer, but Elijah heard the absence around it. Tawa's mother was gone. The boy wore grief the way some men wore a revolver. Close, constant, never discussed. Outside, rain ticked on tin and ran in silver threads from the eaves. The river sounded fuller now, restless in the dark. Somewhere across the fields a horse whinnied and was answered by silence. Bell had ridden back toward town to gather whoever still remembered shame. Elijah had not trusted him entirely, but Bell's face in the barn had been the face of a man stepping out from under his own cowardice and finding it heavier than expected. Whether that would hold by morning was another question. Nita had fallen asleep against a sack of seed corn. Elijah covered her better, then sat opposite Tawa with the leather packet between them. Up close the blue thread binding it snagged at some memory he could not yet catch. "You could have run at the river," Elijah said. "When Caleb fell." Tawa shrugged, but it was too small for indifference. "He was drowning." "That enough reason?" "Yes." Elijah studied him. "Even with men like Pike hunting you." Tawa looked down at his hands. "A child is a child." For a moment the rain seemed to recede, leaving only that sentence in the shed. "A child is a child. Simple as a fence post. Heavy as stone." Tawa reached beneath his shirt again, slower this time, and drew out a locket on a broken chain. Silver, oval, dented near the hinge. Elijah's breath stopped. Sarah's initials were carved inside the clasp, tiny and neat. Work he had paid a peddler in Abilene to do the summer Caleb was born. He did not take it at once. His fingers hovered, shaking once before he forced them still. "Where," he said, "did you get this?" "My mother gave it to me when fever took her," Tawa answered. "She said if I ever found Elijah Cole, I should place it in his hand and tell him the truth he was denied." Elijah closed his fist around the locket. The metal was cold enough to ache. Tawa spoke into the silence that followed. "Years ago, soldiers and town riders came to our winter camp. Pike rode with them. My mother said your wife hid her and 2 other children in a root cellar behind a church ruin near the river. She said your wife stood in the doorway when Pike fired into the smoke, and the bullet meant for my mother struck her instead." Elijah stared at him. "I thought Comanches killed Sarah," he whispered. "My mother said Sarah died, saving Comanche children." Tawa swallowed. "She kept the locket all these years because she feared bringing it back would get you killed too. She said the wrong men were praised and the right dead blamed." The room swayed once, though Elijah knew it did not truly move. All those years of grief had hardened around a lie and worn his heart to fit it. He remembered Sarah's body on a wagon, remembered Pike's hand heavy on his shoulder, remembered the town telling the story so many times it ceased to sound like a story at all and became law. He opened the locket. Inside, under cracked glass, was the tiny curl of Caleb's baby hair Sarah had tucked there. One pale thread remained. Elijah lowered his head. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet but steady. "Why tell me now?" "Because Pike took your son," Tawa said. "Because lies are how men like him keep killing." Nita stirred in her sleep. Elijah rose, crossed the shed once, and knelt before Tawa. For a moment neither moved. Then Elijah put Sarah's locket around his own neck and rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "I should have known sooner," he said. "You know now? That was not forgiveness. It was better. It was truth without ornament." Elijah stood and took up the survey packet. "By dawn, we go to town." Tawa's eyes sharpened. "To trade?" "No," Elijah's voice came low and iron hard. "To end this in daylight where everybody can see what kind of man Harlan Pike has always been." Rain eased. In the east, beyond the black ribs of the cottonwoods, the first thin whitening of morning touched the sky. Warmth had entered the shed, but danger had not left it. Pike still had Caleb. Pike still had guns, men, and a town trained to believe him. Elijah checked the cylinder of his revolver, then looked at Tawa. "When this is over," he said, "if you still want to leave, I won't stop you." Tawa nodded once. "When this is over, we will decide after." It was the closest thing to trust either of them knew how to offer. Dry Hollow gathered in front of the church just after sunrise, drawn by rumor the way crows find fresh turned earth. Boots ground the street dust into pale clouds. Wagon wheels creaked. Horses stamped and tossed their heads in the cool light. The bell above the church door hung silent, but the whole square felt like a waiting mouth. Pike stood on the steps with Caleb beside him, one hand clamped around the boy's shoulder. The bruise above Caleb's brow had darkened. He looked tired, angry, and very small under Pike's grip. 2 of Pike's riders flanked them with rifles across their chests. Sheriff Bell stood near the hitch rail, face set like a man who had chosen his side too late to feel clean about it. When Elijah rode in, the square shifted. People saw the locket at his throat, saw Tawa walking beside the mule with Nita hidden behind him, saw also that Elijah had not come begging. He had come straight-backed and empty-handed except for the survey packet tucked in his belt and a farmer's plain fury riding close under the skin. Pike smiled for the crowd. "There's our fool. You bring me what's mine." Elijah dismounted slowly. "I brought what belongs to the town." Pike tightened on Caleb. "Careful." Elijah looked only at his son. "You hurt bad." Caleb lifted his chin. "No, sir." That "sir" nearly broke him, but he let it harden instead. Bell stepped forward. "Pike, let the boy go. This has gone far enough." Pike barked a laugh. "You found a spine overnight." "Maybe," Bell said. "Maybe I just got tired of mistaking you for law." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elijah drew out the survey packet and held it high. This was stolen from the county office and hidden after Pike moved boundary stones on the north draw. He planned to choke water from every farm east of the river and blame it on drift and flood. He turned, making sure every face could see him. "The Comanche boy you were ready to hang saw Pike murder a man over these papers." Pike's smile flattened. Word of a savage and a grieving fool. Then let truth speak plainer, Elijah said. He touched the locket at his chest. Years ago my wife Sarah was said to have died in a Comanche raid. That was the lie told in this town, and I believed it because it hurt less than asking who benefited. Last night, I learned she was shot by Harlan Pike while shielding children he meant to kill. This was returned to me by the son of one of those children. Gasps moved through the square. Old Mrs. Dunn, who had once tended the church root cellar during winter food drives, covered her mouth. Dear God, she whispered. Sarah did hide some children that day. I saw the blankets after. Pike swung Caleb forward as a shield. Enough. Tawa stepped out before anyone could stop him. You killed my uncle, he said. His voice was young, but it carried. You took these papers. You tied me to a wagon. You would kill my sister too. Pike spat. And who would mourn either of you? I would, Caleb said. Silence fell heavy as wet wool. Pike looked down at him, startled. That was the crack. Elijah saw it and moved. His revolver cleared leather in one smooth motion, but he did not fire at Pike's heart. He shot the church bell rope above the steps. The bell crashed down between Pike and his men in a burst of splintered wood and bronze thunder. Horses reared. The crowd scattered. Bell lunged left, slamming one rifleman aside. Tawa darted up the steps low and fast. Caleb dropped where he stood just as Pike fired. The shot tore through Elijah's coat sleeve, hot and close. Elijah fired again, this time at Pike's hand. The revolver spun away across the planks. Pike drew a knife and seized Caleb by the collar, dragging him toward the church door. Tawa hit him from the side. The two crashed together. Pike backhanded the boy hard enough to send him reeling, then raised the knife. Elijah had the shot. He also had Sarah's locket against his chest, and the years behind him, and the future watching from the churchyard in 3 frightened children's faces. Drop it, he said. Pike snarled, and came anyway. The knife never reached him. Bell fired from below the steps, taking Pike through the shoulder. The man spun, lost footing, and slammed against the church rail. The knife clattered away. Townsmen who had once followed him without thinking now surged forward only to pin him down, rough and wordless, as if ashamed their hands had learned justice so late. Pike, bleeding and wild-eyed, stared up at Elijah. Should have let the river keep them. Elijah looked at him a long moment. That's the difference between us. Bell snapped irons on Pike's wrists. Caleb ran to Elijah then, hard enough to nearly knock him back a step. Elijah held him with one arm and reached the other toward Tawa, who stood dazed with blood at the corner of his mouth and fire in his eyes. Nita ran to her brother and gripped his hand. The 3 of them stood there in the brightening morning while Dry Hollow watched its old story collapse. What shocked the town came next. Elijah turned to Bell. File the charges. All of them. Bell nodded. Then Elijah faced the crowd. These children will stay on my land as long as they choose. Any man who comes for them comes through me first. He drew the folded deed from inside his coat. And before witnesses, I set aside the river pasture and south field in trust for Tawa and Nita, for the life Pike tried to steal from them. My wife died protecting their blood. My house will not do less. Nobody spoke. At last Mrs. Dunn stepped forward with a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth and placed it in Nita's hands. Then another farmer removed his hat. Then another. By summer the North Draw markers were reset. Pike stood trial in Santa Fe. Caleb healed. Tawa planted corn by the lower fence and taught Nita where the river ran safest. Some evenings Elijah would find the children sitting on the porch Sarah once painted blue, listening to the wind move through wheat like faraway applause. Years later, travelers passing the coal farm would see 4 names carved into the gate beam, and below them Sarah's silver locket flashing softly in the sunset, while the river rolled gold beyond the fields.